pieces, little wood boxes.
Oh, those were beautiful. That was a good show. We've lost Tanya.
Yeah, we've lost Tanya, but we are live, so should we just, it's 11 o'clock. Why don't we, do you want to?
It's up to you, whatever you want to do.
For a minute.
All right, we'll give her a minute. It's just 11, so.
How are you two recovering from the flood? What's happened to your
I
offices?
wasn't there, thank goodness. The staff has been working remotely for most of the time since the pandemic began. So it wasn't a problem in terms of continuity of the office. And I think now that they've been working remotely, they're happy working remotely. At the outset, almost none of them, except for me, because I worked at home for 19 years before I got elected, but nobody had offices set up at home. And you know what I'm talking about. If you don't have a space that's right for you, then it's a challenge, particularly for those with kids. We didn't have too many staff with kids, thank goodness, but they've all made the adjustment. I think they're happy. Getting them back into the office would be the challenge.
If we ever get our office back.
How is your office? What happened with
The
it?
first floor was 2.5, 3 feet on the first floor. It was one of the 4 line buildings on the stretch.
Right.
It was 12 months of students to get in.
There has begun a quiet conversation about the future of this end of that end of State Street, which is appropriate, but it's part of a bigger conversation about how much square footage do we need going forward. But as for the future of those 3 buildings, the 3 old ones
Right.
remain, including 110 down the street, the brick building, I hope that the let's tear them down and start over crowd doesn't win. Because this is the smallest state capital in the country. It has a lot of charm. I mean, downtown has its own issues. The residents have to work through that. But it would be a shame to me to lose those buildings. Whether I and my crew in the future stay there or not isn't the point. The buildings have history and help make this street.
Right.
So I spoke to David Sheets because I found out the name of the guy who lifts buildings. He's 85. He's from East Montpelier. He's been doing this for 40 years. His name is Norm Messier. And any major building that's been moved in the last 40 years, he did. So the point is just pick it up, get rid of the basement, put in a new foundation and raise it to where it needs to be.
Right.
You have to change the landscaping around it. But that would be a lot cheaper than trying to replace it, I think. Anyway, that's my pitch. So if you hear people talking about it, don't say, gosh, it's a problem, we should just tear it
They
down.
did that to my old bookstore. We raised it, we jacked it up, I don't know, 10 feet, redid the basement, and then,
Excellent.
In Charlotte, this was in Charlotte. This was many, many years ago.
Oh,
Flying Pig, yes. And it was so much less expensive than, that we only had a finite amount of space to work with anyway, so that's what we worked with. Then we're like, okay, and they just jacked up. I was like, we can jack up a whole place. And then I moved a barn and it was less expensive to dig a new foundation than it would have been to work in place and jack up the barn. But you can pick up a building and move it on a crane. I had no idea. Kind of cool.
It is.
My favorite spot.
That's great. I hope that's what they do as well. And it was on VPR this morning on my drive in, they were talking about what are we going to do for space? People were complaining that the pavilions particularly is worried about the loss of offices. So it'll be.
I was at National Life recently. We were onboarding a new employee, and to describe it as a ghost town, the state element of it would be an understatement. I mean, it was like those big open floor plans with 0 people.
Oh, wow.
So space issues are all been shuffled because use of the space changed after the pandemic.
Right.
One of the real questions, we talk about performance. I still have to wonder that with all of the change of folks working at home as opposed to working in the office, has performance suffered or has it improved?
It's hard to know for other offices. I can tell you that we have a small office, as you know. I know these people. I know the 3 people who are audit managers who manage all the jobs, and I trust them. And if people were slacking, we'd know about it. I'm okay. The rest of the state government, I have no idea.
Well,
Performance audit.
Tough one to measure.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, there's the mental health component too, like
yeah.
being in your home all day, every day, is that mentally?
But look at me.
some people it's really good for, and others not so much, right? And I know I would go crazy if I didn't, or at least I drive everyone in my house crazy if I didn't have someone to talk to during the day. But we do both.
Right.
I guess we should just get started. So
Yeah.
we are back on. We were just taking a little break for those of us, for those who are watching. And we're excited to welcome the auditor and the deputy auditor, Deputy Tim Ash and the auditor Doug Hopper, to us today to talk some more about accountability and where do we go from here? And boy, we could really use some specific direction at this point in the morning. Anyhow, thank you.
Thank you. Happy to share my thoughts. And for the folks who are relatively new, who I don't think I've met in committee, a lot of folks don't know what we do. And it's interesting that one of the folks from NCSL talked about it just in a slide. Yes, there is the financial audit component and the compliance audit component. Those are done by a contractor outside of our office. Historically, state auditors did the financial audit and in some cases compliance. When I say compliant, today what that means is the federal single audit, which tracks compliance with federal rules and statute because there's so much federal money. And they want to know if you're using it as you're supposed to use it, which is perfectly appropriate. It's not terribly fun or exciting work from my perspective, but it's really important. So I'm glad that we have other people doing it because that leaves us free to do performance auditing. And that gets me to my point. Tim gave you the history of this most recent experience, and I was reminded by what this fellow said earlier. I've been working on performance measurement for 30 years. I took a job under contract with then auditor Ed Flanagan back in the 90s. And one of the jobs I did was in response to what was then a relatively new statutory provision, which is 32307C, which is well known to Appropriations Committee members and others. The one that says when you submit your budget through the governor, it will include a strategic plan and metrics to measure performance. That was in 1994. Well, no, I think it was 94. And at the same time, interestingly, GASB, which is the Government Accounting Standards Board, issued what was referred to as Concepts Statement Number 2. I don't know what number 1 was, but this was pretty early in their modern configuration. And it said, as important as the financial auditing and compliance auditing are, that's not the end of our work. That's the beginning of a much bigger conversation, which is we know where the money is, we know we're doing it according to the law. Are we achieving the goals established by the legislature? And that was not being done by state auditors. So Ed Flanagan, to his credit, partly because he wanted to cause trouble, but that's okay. You like auditors who want to cause a little trouble. He said, we're going to do some of that. He hired me and there was another person in the office. And we did some of that, and that was the beginning. Now, it won't surprise you to know that the administration at that time, the Dean administration, wasn't keen on this. Agencies and departments hadn't been given direction, training, money, or a reason to do it, other than it was in statute. I'd like to find out which of your former colleagues put 307C in there. I'm not sure who it is. But it made it difficult. And when we issued the first of the 2 reports we did on the subject, that was the beginning of my not making friends in state government. But it was a good subject, and it really piqued my interest for this reason. And to get to this broader question about why does it matter, to me, there are 3 elements. One is managers of programs need good information about whether programs are working. And if they're not, if you can tweak them, do it. If it's not working at all, then go back to you guys and say, we need something different completely. Of course, that almost never happens, as you well know, which is really sad to me because I think that's a huge missed opportunity, particularly in the area that I know a lot about, economic development. So that's one. Program management benefits from good performance measurement. The other is you guys. Policymakers can't make informed decisions without this kind of information. And it's not just return on investment, although that's critical, but you guys bring passion to these things, whether it's childcare, public health, public safety, whatever it might be, and you want to leave Vermont better than the day you took office. And you need programs that work, so you need that information. And the other is that citizens have every right to know how their money is being used. So I take that really seriously, and that's why I enjoy this job. But the point is, GASB issued Concepts Number 2 in 1994, I think, and they said, here's a way that we think state auditors can incorporate this into their work. And it was called SEA, Service, Efforts, and Accomplishments. And it was the simplest thing in the world. And I'll get to later why I think it's so much better than RBA. Very simple. Inputs, outputs, and outcomes. That's it. Now, it sounds easy. The first 2 actually are easy. How much are you investing in this program? In people, dollars, and other types of resources. Outputs are simple. How many miles of road did you pave? How many kids got vaccines? Whatever it may be, you can measure those two without too much trouble. And in fact, Sue Zeller, you guys know, from the original GAC thing, she worked for Jim Reardon in finance and management as his deputy. And when I persuaded the legislature, not all of them, but a few, got it into the big bill one year, to do something called the Unified Economic Development Budget, which brought a holistic approach to economic development because it's always disparate stuff. She did the first two of those. She answered the questions for Commerce, the agency, about how much and outputs. And they didn't do so well on outcomes. In fact, they failed miserably. So a couple of years later, Vince Aluzzi and Lawrence Miller got rid of it, which really pissed me off. It was before I took office. In any case, the administration then wasn't keen on this. And this conversation that you had with them earlier about a champion is absolutely essential. If the governor doesn't buy into this stuff, or somebody delegated by the governor with power, then it's not going to happen. It might happen here and there for a commissioner or a secretary who cares about data. Con Hogan, a name that some of you might know, was a guy who loved data. And he was at corrections, and then he became the secretary of the Agency of Human Services. And wherever he was, there was data and there was analysis. And he did a pretty good job, but most of his colleagues didn't, and they felt they were too busy. It was a burden. There wasn't enough resources, blah, blah, blah. So it really didn't catch on. Not under Jim Douglas, not under Pete Shumlin, and in my view, not under Phil Scott. It's not a political issue. It's a nonpartisan issue. It's a failure, as far as I'm concerned, on the part of leadership. After 307C didn't really take hold, Jim Douglas had a process that you probably recall. I know you do, challenges for change. It was intended to do a lot of things, all of them well-intentioned, but primarily to save money. I think the goal was to say, oh, state government's too big. We could do this for less. And that sounds good. It's good sound bite. And it may well be true in some circumstances. On the other hand, there are lots of things where you can't solve the problem without more money, period. And two of them were brought up in reports we just did. One's dam safety. The EC simply didn't have enough bodies to go out and check the condition of the state's dams. Luckily, we didn't have a big one fall apart. The next time, we probably will. So, saying to yourself, how can we do that job with less money is just nonsensical. The other is Dale. We did a job on long-term care and Dale's oversight of long-term care facilities, which is meaningful to me. My father just passed, he was 99. It's a big deal. The state is taking some responsibility for our elder friends and family and their safety in typically private entities that are licensed by the state and monitored to some extent. As it turns out, the ones that are not nursing homes, and they get special treatment because they get federal money, but the assisted care places and the residential care homes are not inspected with the kind of regularity that you put in statute. And it's disturbing and really frustrating because one of the things we learned was, and this is what I alluded to before, Dale decided to interpret the meaning of the statute on their own. They didn't go to the AG, they didn't come to you. They just said, we think this means that we only have to do this every couple of years. That's not what it said. Instead of saying, we could interpret it in the most generous way, not the most conservative way, and simply say to the legislature, we need more money. Now, they've done that since, but they're not going to catch up. So I mention all this only because the challenges for change thing I thought was a bit of a game, but that didn't work. So that's the process. We're now up to, then you get to GAC. They had a bad product, as we pointed out. That report, the annual outcomes report, I think is the official title, something like that, is not a good piece of work, in my opinion. It doesn't help you at all. And it also is a problem because it's from the administration. And GAC was a sometimes during the off-season meeting group, no resources. And furthermore, not only was the product that they were given not great, but there wasn't an understood and shared view of what to do with the information provided. Should they give it to appropriations? Should they give it to the committees of jurisdiction? Should they do both? Should they do something new? It never got that far. So another well-intentioned effort that didn't really work. I'm thrilled that you are asking yourselves this question and you haven't given up on this because it's really, really important and I care about it. So that's kind of the Wayback Machine all the way back to the 90s on this. And time is right for a reconsideration of all that's come before and what's possible. And these guys are on top of it. They know what's going on. It's not really rocket science. And as I said, the barrier that is sometimes thrown up to you, whether it's JFO or an agency or department, we don't have the resources. That's, if I were you, I'd say baloney. You know, we create a program and you're spending $40 million a year, put some aside. If you don't, we will never know what the true ROI or performance is. You have to do this. I don't know how you could say otherwise, frankly. Is it easy? No. Bureaucrats are trying to do their job and implement these programs that you create with good faith. And they don't want to put money aside for this other stuff, but you have to do that. So the process question, which I think is most important to you, I would not advocate creating a standalone standing committee, because I'm of the opinion, based on my observation of your work over the years, and he knows better, he was in it with you. I think the standing committees of jurisdiction for all various issues need to do a little bit more of this work themselves. Appropriations is where the money ends up being appropriated, and their role is critical. They are hugely overworked, and they're good people. As far as I can tell, they're great people. But I would argue that you shouldn't wait for the administration to come in January and say, here's our 8 proposals to each committee. Well, first of all, you're on their page. You haven't had a chance to say, let's first talk about the performance of the programs we created over the last 10 years. How they were, before you say new stuff or say, yeah, last year we had 2 million, now we want 3, whatever it might be. All appropriate. But once you get going, it's their show and not yours anymore. And then you have no way to break out of that, the momentum that's developed in considering new proposals, and if your appropriations, the money thing is dense and deep. So I would say, look, instead of taking the first couple of weeks of a committee's existence, both in the first and second year of the biennium, saying, hi, welcome back. We know you're the commissioner. How you doing? You brought your deputy with you, and we're going to introduce ourselves and go around. Isn't that nice? Who cares? You know, dig in. Say, tell us now. The first week is going to be spent on you justifying your existence. I mean, obviously you do that politely and professionally, but my point is, where is that conversation? I haven't seen it. And my point is, if information, let's go back to 307C for a minute. As I said, they require a strategic plan, which is already a challenge because some departments can't imagine their own strategic plan. Nevertheless, it also says, what are the metrics you're going to use to measure your performance and whether you're achieving the goals of that strategic plan? It does not say you have to provide data about those metrics, which is the most curious thing to me. I don't know why. You could change that. And 2 things could happen. One is, as budgets are developed in the late summer and fall, and eventually formalized and given to you, that 1,700-page document, some of the departments provide actual information, some don't, because they're not required to, and nobody makes them do that. But the annual outcomes report is, in my view, forgive me, I'm not trying to be rude to the people who work on it, but it's useless. It's not program focused. Population measures are nearly useless because of the real fact that states, particularly small states, you can't have any impact on the macro economy of the United States. So if you look at the unemployment rate for Vermont and compare it in a line next to the United States, they track exactly together, year after year. We're typically a little bit lower, thankfully, but there are reasons for that. But we don't deviate. So what have you learned by having them report the unemployment measure to you, other than saying, I'm glad it's as low as it is, or if it's high, that's a shame? You're not the federal government. You don't have those tools. So anyway, back to process. If the standing committees were given information before January, God forbid, because those departments and agencies who put together annual reports, and some of them do with good data, some do good jobs. A&R is a data-driven group. Department of Health is a data-driven group. There are those in state government who do have data. Some have questionable data. Some are a mess. But if you required not only 307C to include that, but say to everybody, look, we want that stuff early. I mean, the PROPS is already working in December, but if the the administration's final push, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, on the budget preparation is the money piece. The performance measurement stuff, to the extent it's there, is always lags a little bit anyway. The data's yesterday. So I don't think that would be any problem for them to supply you with that. It wouldn't have any impact on the governor's proposal. He's free to do what he wants with his budget. But that would give all of you a chance to begin to look at that stuff in advance. And more importantly, and here's another area where somebody would say, oh my God, it's too much work. JFO, I think, should get more resources. That's a whole separate but related issue. They could look at some of this stuff for you. Not, in terrible detail, but kind of up a couple steps just to say, in our view, here are some questions you should ask, which I think is what you guys desperately need. Because all of your committees have smart, focused people. Some have more experience in the issue than others, but not everybody brings an outside perspective. You guys listen to the bureaucrats endlessly. And some issues are informed by outside parties. There's environmental groups that can be part of that conversation. In healthcare, not too much. Economic development, almost nothing. But there are issues. But there are issues where you hear from others, but it's typically people with a vested interest.
Right.
So you need objective information and perspective, context, and JFO that should be their job, it seems to me. Part of it. And I would have no objection as a citizen to paying more for them to do more for you. So if you get the information in advance, if I were on approach, I would want to rely on your committees of jurisdiction. And by the way, I don't mean GovOps doesn't have a role, but GovOps can't do what we're talking about. It's too big. So I think appropriations would be great if your committees fed them some informed thoughts about program stuff. The money, that's going to be appropriations job, but they already ask. I know in our budget instructions for my office, they say, send us what 307C says. Send us your strategic plan and the metrics that you use. Well, I send them data. It's not that much we can do, but I send them what I can. So they do that, but I'm not sure they get, as we discussed in passing, can you trust a lot of that data? Frankly, no governor is objective in promoting his or her own programs and perspective on what state government can and should do and how much of this, that, or the other. So you've got to, you and your colleagues have to be very careful and view all performance data with a very critical eye. Now, I spent a lot of time looking at economic development stuff, and you can't trust anything. I'm exaggerating a bit, but there's a lot. Now, that's a particularly tough area. Economic development's really hard to say with any certainty. We know that these entities are responsible for this change or these outcomes. There's so many different factors influencing the outcome of the economy. It's almost impossible to do it. But they don't even try. They just assume that what they're doing is working. And then they tell you why, which is because it's working. Anyway, so I don't know how you do this, except maybe just sit back a little bit when you hear administration people come in who are running programs. I would, if I were you, I would ask the chair of my committee, can we budget more time? Not once, but every single year to this, at the beginning of the conversation, before we get lost in the 4 proposals that are so detailed that we don't have time to read them all.
And also budget adjustment helps us on that. It always brings out, what are you dropping to the bottom line? Why? Why is there leftover money in that department? We ask that question all the time. Do we get straight answers? Not so much.
Right. And, the question I asked them would be fascinating for you guys to ask, or for us, although I'm not sure that the various agencies and departments could answer the question well or easily. How much do you spend in Dale or DCF on evaluating your performance? I don't know. I mean, everybody says it's so expensive. Well, okay, if AHS is spending, what do they spend now? Almost $2 billion a year? Well, that's a lot of it's medical.
Half the state government.
But it's a lot of money. So if they spend, I don't know, $1 million on evaluating the performance of a $2 billion agency, is that a lot? I don't think so. I don't know what the numbers are. I'm just making them, but you get my point. We don't know the answer. And maybe this would not be easy to do, and you don't want to, it's not one size fits all. But each time, back to your repeated comment about we want to bring this back to specific legislation, because that's half the issue. You could always say, put aside 2%, pick a number, and you're going to do this work and you're going to report to us. And just know that you can't spend that 2% on anything else, even though you could come back and say, we've got, kids who need help. That's true, but we don't know if this program is helping enough kids, so you've got to spend this on analyzing the outcomes. I would try to do something, I would think about that at any rate.
One of the issues in all of this too, when we hear things from the administration, we believe that folks are basically honest, but there is a real tendency to support the things that you believe in and are charged with doing. And that's why it's so critical to have some of the evaluation done by an independent party who doesn't have a vested interest. And to that end, I believe that the state auditor's office has a role here, and that role should be, in terms of funding, should be enhanced to enable you to do more of those things. You started off with a definition of what the state auditor does, and I agree with that, but I had another definition that I used years ago, and that is there are 5 constitutional officers in the state of Vermont, and the job of the auditor is to protect you from the other 4.
Fair enough. That's true. I would welcome more resources, and it's interesting because Tim and I had a conversation with Ann Cummings and Emily, as a matter of fact, earlier this year about largely but our collective frustration with the legislative requirement that we audit every single TIF town 3 times during its life cycle. It is eating resources in my office. It's 15 or 20% of our resources, day in and day out. Now, we have now done all of the extant TIFs at least once, some twice. There may be others created. But the frustrating part is not only that it eats resources and not doing other work, there's an opportunity cost, but also that in some cases, those audits have led to findings and recommendations that have been ignored, either by VEPC itself, you guys may not know a lot about TIF, or by you guys. In a couple of instances, the legislature has said in response to, hey, we found a problem, and the towns say, but we want to do this, they go give the towns what they want. Why don't we just spend 6 months reviewing their TIF work if all you're going to do is give them a get out of jail free card? I don't want to do that. I'm not happy doing that. I don't think it's the best use of our resources. So we're going to ask them to take us off the dole and allow us to reallocate those resources. Having said that, we can always audit TIF towns. We can always follow state money anywhere, anytime. So it's not as if I don't think TIF is worthy of our time. It is. But we found a bunch of issues in the course of our work over the last 3 years or so that pretty much covers the waterfront. So I would like to repurpose that person, that new position that we actually got during budget adjustment. I don't know that that's ever been done before. Well, probably in big departments, but they were kind enough to give us the person when I cried about how much resources it's eating. So I'd love to use that. I mean, every auditor is going to be different, but I would be happy to permanently allocate some in-house resources to this work to feed you guys. Now, obviously, we can't do it all, just like JFO can't do it all, but you can do some work. For example, I think you guys got, I don't know if you were involved, but I think you were. Tax expenditures just kept growing over time in the 90s and aughts. And, and before you know it, they represent a lot of money. And somebody finally said, are they achieving what we intended? And how much money are we spending? So I think JFO was told to review them all in sequence over like 3 years or something. So you could have a cycle for performance measurement review of departments and agencies. You can't do them all at once. You don't need to. So that's a thought as well. But I would be delighted to repurpose some of our resources to this. I don't know that I want to be boxed in like with the TIF stuff, but as long as I'm around, I care about this stuff. I mean, witness the job we did on the annual outcomes report. I hope, if you haven't, I hope you get a chance to read it. It's not that long.
I brought copies of them and you can also look them up.
In black and white?
Yeah.
Oh.
I didn't actually bring them.
I was just worried that you might go directly to, and I wanted to make sure.
If I can interject though on the issue of
Recycle.
the tax expenditures, if I can interject, in the interest of accountability, the way we ensured that there would be a justification for every tax expenditure in the tax code is we said that if they were not in place in statute by a date certain, the entire tax code was effectively deleted. And that put some pressure on everyone to get the job done, and it didn't happen. But also, if you look in statute, you'll see sprinkled all over, wherever there's a tax expenditure, it'll say the reason effectively for this expenditure is thus and such. Like GAC, once those were put in place, there wasn't really a process to go back and make sure that they were properly done. They were kind of starter explanations.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a handful of people who championed that. I was in that list. And I confess that structurally, it clearly didn't work because people didn't keep returning to it and say, you know, is that really why we provide a tax deduction for
And are the same
this
entities
particular
benefiting
use?
that we intended?
Yeah, exactly. Sorry.
No, please, thank you. So I'm almost done and then I'll give it to Tim, but the report includes a number of bullet items that represent principles of the term we used, but issues that should be part of any good performance measurement process, and many of which were missing in the report that we critiqued. And the first and arguably the most important one is this idea of population measures. As I said before, there are lots of things that we can't touch. They're too big. And to assume that your little programs, even though they might cost hundreds of millions of dollars, are really going to move the dial on some things that are a function of our culture and our larger society and or the economy is wishful thinking. So I would say, forget it. You don't need it. Stick with measuring the performance of the programs you create and the money you spend directly. And unemployment was a good example, by the way. Another one is clear goals and objectives. And the best one to me is the population level measure was Vermont has a prosperous economy. What does that mean? It's not defined. You know that we could find some people easily in this building right now that would say radically different things about what a prosperous economy is. Can we be a prosperous economy when 11% of our people are in poverty? I don't think so, but I mean, some people would. Oh, the stock market's doing well, unemployment's low, and so forth. So that's a tough one, as I said earlier, when departments and agencies are required to create a strategic plan. That begins with the mission. And you'd be surprised at how many struggle with a clear and concise mission. Concise, listen to me go on about concise. There's another one about comparability, very important. And this is a problem with every governor that I've been in Vermont for, that's 35 years. If they want to make you believe that we are desperately in need of something new or that something they've done is great, they'll give you a piece, a sliver of information with no context whatsoever, right? Oh my God, we have a problem with population. So does every other New England state. We have a problem with median income, or something's good with median income. Well, what they didn't do in this report is adjust for inflation, which shows it almost flat as opposed to a steep line. Furthermore, they didn't break it out. Median is a perfectly good measure, better than average for income. But they didn't say, as we did, gosh, I wonder how the change over time has been for the quintiles of income. Low, 20% all the way up to the top. And clearly it's like this. Most of the money goes to the people at the top. And again, can we have a prosperous economy with such unequal distribution of income and wealth? And the answer, no. So these are the kinds of things, they're in the report. These bullets are very, very important if you're going to do the work or if departments are going to do the work and feed you this information. This is the kind of stuff they need to know. But back to the original thing on the service efforts and accomplishments, it's not that hard. How much are you spending? How much are you getting for it? Outputs, purely outputs. How many widgets did we create? And then outcomes is different. That's qualitative often. Are they good widgets? Are there bridges falling down that you built? That's a bit of an exaggeration, but those are the three. And that hasn't changed from GASB in all this time. So, but I'm not keen on or comfortable with RBA. That's a larger discussion, but I don't think it works that well. I know a lot of people got maybe not sucked in, but thought it had merit. And it may for some people, but it doesn't for me. But I'm sorry, Tim, I've taken a lot of time.
No, I'll be brief, but I'm just going to start quickly with the outcomes report, not to go through it, but to speak to how I hope you will look at it as a way of thinking about the work, even if it's not about the outcomes report specifically. So in the outcomes report, as you look through it, you'll see our critique, if you will, of a number of the indicators that were presented. And one of them that stood out, and this is probably, I feel a little unkind picking on this example because it seems to be the most far-fetched, but there is one of the indicators is percentage of Vermonters with state-of-the-art telecommunications. When we did the report, we were quite surprised to see a graph that said 93% of Vermonters had state-of-the-art telecommunications. This was the 2021 report.
How's it working, Wendy?
So we pointed out that could only be based on a determination of state-of-the-art telecommunications that you would not find a single Vermonter could agree with. After producing the report and explaining this, the 2022 outcomes report kept effectively the same graph. It's now 97%. And so the data visualization and different ways of communicating important information is a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, some people would look at these trend lines and say, oh, that's wonderful, but it requires someone to step back and say, what are they actually presenting in this picture? And I think the outcomes report hasn't been a very useful way to do that. I know that Tim, when he was up here doing the overview, talked about adult tobacco use as one of the Vermonters with healthy indicators. If you actually go to the outcomes report and look at the visualization, it will show annual changes fluctuating between 16, 17%, and so on. And it has directional arrows, green arrows for signaling that we're going in the right direction, and it tells you how long it's been doing that. Red means we're going in the wrong direction. And for that indicator, you see greens and reds and a little bit of movement. Well, it turns out that for about the 7 years that are presented in the visual, the margin of error included almost all of the changes year to year. So the actual effect from start to finish was no statistically significant change. Now, this isn't to pick on the person who produced the report, but to say that the types of principles that Doug was outlined, a few of them, are meant to say, how do we ask specific questions about the information we're receiving so that we're not deluding ourselves into thinking the world is one way when in fact might have not changed at all because of our interventions or is changing in ways we don't like. Several of you have talked about the different ways of having, making sure that the legislation you pass is achieving its objectives and that in totality it produces broader outcomes. There is another accountability feature, which is just making sure that the administrative agencies of the executive branch are just doing the things that you ask them to do and in the time frame perhaps that you suggested doing. So an example of that on my little side projects in the office was I looked back from 2017 legislation through 2021 and looked for any new instance where there was a rulemaking provision. In 5 years, and my list might not have been perfect, but for the purposes of illustration, it's fine. There were about 125 instances where there were new rules requested or authorized. The disparity in how those rules were written, what was requested of the executive branch, varied greatly. Sometimes an agency may promulgate rules. Sometimes they shall promulgate rules, so now they have to do it. Sometimes it was they shall do it, they have to, by a date certain. Sometimes it was they have to do it by a date certain and we want a progress report in the meantime. So you had all of these different approaches to rulemaking. So then I went back and looked at all the ones that were required to be done to see how many had been done. And of the roughly probably 70 or so that were shall promulgate rules, more than 30 of them had not been done. Some of them hadn't been done for 4 or 5 years. Now, some of them may have been not the biggest priorities of the legislature, but a good example where there was more interest was around water quality. There was a specific piece of legislation, I can't remember which particular year it had been in 2021, relating to wetlands rulemaking. And I don't know if the legislature originated this or if it was the Agency of Natural Resources. That sort of doesn't matter. But it said that by, I think, January of 22, they would report on their progress on rulemaking to the legislative committees, and that by March 1st, the final rule would be adopted. Well, after March 1st, I looked and I couldn't find any evidence of the rule. Then I couldn't find any evidence of the report. So I reached out to some of the legislative committee people at the same time that I reached out to the agency people. The agency people, I said, so can you send me the rule? Because it was supposed to be in place. And they said, effectively, we kind of forgot that that was supposed to happen. And I said, well, did you report to the legislature? And to their credit, the agency said, it was a big miss. We missed the report, we missed the rulemaking. And the committees themselves had forgotten that they had imposed these deadlines. Now, the reason I illustrate that is because many rulemaking provisions are where the rubber hits the road in terms of implementing things, especially around natural resources. But the legislature has not had a very uniform approach to the rulemaking process. So we sent a memo to the members of LCAR I'm not sure how, as a newer member, the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules, the last stop for rulemaking, suggesting that Leg Council staff, whenever they're drafting bills and rulemaking comes up, ask a few basic questions of the committee. Do you want to authorize this or require it? If you want to require it, do you want to require it by a specific date or not? What should that date be if we want to require it? What's reasonable? You're going to work with the agency on that. And then finally, do we want a status report in the meantime in case things aren't going according to plan? Just a basic set of questions to create more uniformity so that you don't have this issue occurring. Doug mentioned dams and the dam audit we did, and this is a good example of where that comes in. July 1 of 2022, the Agency of Natural Resources sort of subdivision at DEC that does dam safety was supposed to have adopted new rules around the management, inspection, required safety modifications of both private and publicly owned dams all throughout the state. This was the result of legislation from a few years before that had mapped out a series of strategies. Our audit found that they hadn't even initiated the process of rulemaking at the time we were doing the work, which meant there was no way they could meet the deadline. After we flagged this, the agency said, well, we're going to ask for a one-year extension from the legislature. They did not ask the legislature for a one-year extension. Fast forward to today after the flood, which thankfully, as Doug said, there was no major dam failures, which could have killed people or really damaged property. It has still not been filed. So this is one of those instances where, because the legislature in real time wasn't hearing that there were problems adopting these rules, you may well have been on the wrong end of public criticism in terms of accountability because it was the rules that the legislature asked for. So rulemaking is an area I think that there's some simple things that don't even require new laws, but just some practices that would be very helpful. One of the questions this committee has to look at, and Doug touched on it a bit, and it's been part of the discussion, is whether there should be a home for the findings of the audits. And that's not just for the audits that our office produces, although they'll probably most frequently be the most relevant to committees. But there are federal agencies that directly audit state programs from time to time. And right now, the odds that any legislator knows when those come out is virtually zero. Now, some of them might be very tedious and boring, and you're not going to have a lot of interest, but from time to time, there are interesting ones. The U.S. Department of Labor, for instance, does a periodic audit of the Vermont Department of Labor's unemployment program and had about 15 findings in their most recent work. Some of the topics would be well known to those of you who have been dealing with constituents for the last few years. Nonetheless, there are many outstanding findings more than a year after that initial audit report was released by the federal government. Where does that go? If no individual committee member doesn't somehow magically become aware of it, would it ever be forced onto your desk so that you're aware that there's this real tension between a federal agency and one of the state programs? More recently, there was an instance with the Department of Children and Families. They were doing a look back around the child support mechanisms through children and families. As a result of some non-compliance, the state had to send hundreds of thousands of dollars back to the federal government, which no one ever likes to do. I suspect not a single legislator is aware that that occurred, unless I happen to email it because of, the synapses were firing the right way that particular day. And then general oversight function. I had mentioned to Senator Brock, and we had exchanged years ago about this. One of the things that you have as a challenge, in addition to performance measurements and holding government accountable in the programmatic sense, is how to have the ability to respond when something's not really going well in state government. We're finishing up work on EB5, and in some ways, for those of you who don't know, EB5 work in the auditor's office was sort of paused in light of all of the different investigations.
Litigation.
So it would have been not appropriate to keep going at the time. But there was no legislative committee that really stepped back and said, what were some of the systemic or structural issues that could have allowed this to proceed in the manner it did? And what are those lessons we've learned? How might we need to go forward differently to address that? Another example, this is a little bit dated. There was a business in Windham County that had received a variety of state economic development grants. Shortly after receiving the final one of those, they announced that they were picking up shop and moving out of Vermont entirely. And some of the grants they received had recapture provisions, meaning that because they weren't going to be doing anything in Vermont, they would have to return some of the money. Some of the other programs did not have those recapture provisions. So some of us at the time maybe naively wished that there was someone who said, okay, how do we make sure that moving forward, the agencies who are writing the grant program requirements and the consequences for failure to act or these other things, so that we don't have literally $1 coming from one, $2 from the same agency, but under different rules and with different accountability associated. That kind of oversight function, there is always a risk that it could be politicized, which would be probably not appropriate for this committee's viewing. But that's an area GAC didn't really go. And the standing committees have strengths and weaknesses depending on their composition in particular years, and have not really been focused on that kind of systemic structural reform. And then I'll close with one example that speaks to the need for the work that you're doing. And I think especially in terms of legislation, Jessica, you mentioned, and Doug as well. We're about to release a report on dental therapy, which is the legislation that passed dental therapy was in 2016. And we will save the highlights because we want you to be anticipating the final report.
Or talk to me.
But in short, it's now 7 years later, not one student has been enrolled, more than $2 million has been spent on something that many legislators felt very strongly about and believed would increase, especially rural dental services. And for this committee, it raises a very good question. How could it have gone on for so long when we all cared, when collectively we made a decision, we cared greatly about it? What could have intervened sooner so that we knew something was not right and could have made different decisions? Because the legislature has been asked to appropriate funds now several times on top of federal and private monies to deliver a program that has not yet achieved any of the deliverables that people set out to do after 7 years. So I think the work that you're doing is tremendously important and hard, but that last example is a good one, I think, for highlighting the importance of building mechanisms into the legislation on the key things before you.
Let me add one quick thing to that. First of all, the EB5 is not unique. It represents one of those unfortunate conflicts within state government where you have the same entity having some level of oversight and being an advocate. And that was not ever done, in my view, intentionally to screw things up. But you can appreciate why over the decades, very powerful interests who on paper and in the real world provide important benefits to the people and the economy of the state and its social structure, like dairy. People say, well, of course we have to help dairy. Well, over decades, dairy's poisoned the lake. So, can you expect the same people to address both of those sides of the coin? And the answer is no. Not because they're not good, smart, caring people, but because you're asking too much of them. And those aren't the only two examples. It's something to keep an eye out for in government. In addition, Tim's examples are really good because they get to one element of this question, how is your program doing, that we don't think about. And I should have said this earlier. Our work on performance auditing is really sort of two levels. One is just the nuts and bolts of the program. Now, how is it working as a business? Are they doing okay? Are they, as he said, doing what you ask them to do, structurally, mechanically? And sometimes that has very serious real world implications. As I said, Dale decided to interpret a statute on their own. You can't do that. And that led to significant problems with the frequency with which these facilities were inspected. You would never have known that. Never. And I'm embarrassed to say that they don't really seem to care that they did that. They defend that decision. And you should kick their butts for that. But there are other examples throughout state government where the very mechanical aspect of the work, which is not something you would normally consider part of your charge if you're going to be even on your committee of jurisdiction, whether it's GovOps or yours or somewhere else or approach, you take that for granted and you say, well, did you pave those roads? How many miles, the outcome, did you do it? Well, they might say yes, and we got this much. Well, they should have gotten this much. Why didn't they? You don't even know what questions to ask because they don't tell you. They're not keeping it from you, but they're not in the habit of making that part of their presentation. So it's a big cultural change. It's a little more work. It's a different kind of work. You can substitute some of what you're doing for some of this.
Can I ask you a question about that? Because I feel like New Mexico is trying to help the legislature get at those questions. The question is, how much
You have to put in to be able to, how much staff do you need to help you to know what those questions are? If we ask, for example, every year around here, I think we end up with, I don't know this for sure, I'm just throwing this out there, but I think it's over 300 new pieces of legislation, right? No, they won't all get passed, but if they all have performance measures in them, and I guess the ones that get passed, we would then ask either joint fiscal or ledge council to tell us what are the right questions we should be asking. Do you think that's doable?
Yes, I do. You don't have to do it for everything, but there's two ways to get at that. One of them is important and would require more resources for JFO. As you know, JFO's staffs the money committees. I know from experience in one of your committees and its sister committee in the House side, Commerce and Economic Development, involve often a great deal of money, but they don't get a fiscal note, which is somebody either on JFO staff or Tom Govt or someone saying, okay, here's the proposal, I get it. I'm going to spend the time required to answer. The key question is, what is the likely return on this investment? Because that question is only answered by the people advocating for the program. Right. And the private sector.
JFO doesn't really have the capability, at least in my experience, they don't have the capability to look forward. They're able to look backward, they're able to look at other examples, but when you say, what's the return on investment on this, they don't have the capability of doing that.
That's why Tom is so valuable, because he has the model and he's an expert with the model. And they need more of that. They need more of those. They
need more work by economists. And they're severely limited in terms of having that skill set.
As for some of the other stuff, you don't want to overplay the stakeholder card, but there are people outside of government. They have their own agendas, and that's fine. But there's nothing wrong with asking them in the process. And if they don't weigh in, and sometimes they do, you can expect them to, and sometimes they won't. But more information is better than less, in my opinion. Well, that's easy to say since you have to process it all.
The New Mexico example, though, and I think Carrington, if that was his name, he described, is that, and if you look at the examples they sent, they had a series of questions which aren't philosophical. Do you think the state should intervene in child well-being? It's, here's the program, and then a series of accountability-focused questions. You were supposed to do all these things. Have you done them yet? If not, we would like you to tell us specifically why not. Are the results what we hoped they would be? Describe them, and if they're not, tell us what the plan is to modify the practice to do that. wearing my ex-legislator hat for a moment, having sat through possibly thousands of legislative committees, the frequency with which the committee members received a document from some combination of legislative counsel and joint fiscal office saying, here are 5 questions you may wish to ask. Not partisan questions, not questions that challenge the merits, but just about whether the thing is working properly. Was so, I mean, maybe a handful of times, and that would always be because one legislator, maybe in advance, said, you know, I'm not sure about Program X and I want you to help us. And that's good, but that's not a system. That's just spontaneous, value. And so if there are identified key priority areas or key legislation in a particular year, I think the experience that New Mexico has done is very manageable. The work I talked to you about on rulemaking, where I went through, that took me a grand total of 2 days to go through 5 years of legislation and identify every single time, and then catalog them and do all those things. If someone was to do that each year, just for the things that you had just asked for, so that everyone kind of had a little list and knew what was coming, including LCAR, it would take a half a day, I presume, and have this extra value so you don't get caught unawares that things aren't being done on schedule. The same could be done whenever you've got these report backs, so that it doesn't feel like you're sitting in a joint committee meeting and then you're like, oh, we said this date for a report and haven't thought about it once, prior to the joint committee meeting, and then everyone asks random questions, you leave and you wonder if you've made any progress. Those kinds of things can be systematized by your staff, but I don't know that the legislature in general has been very effective in managing the staff in those ways.
Those are excellent points. I mean, I just think about, again, I'll go back to childcare, but in this bill this year, we asked our committee assistant to keep track of every date and put it on next year's calendar so that we are ready. She can say to us when we're doing our scheduling meetings on Tuesday mornings, oh yeah, this week is when they were supposed to come in, let's get them in for that.
There's one issue that hasn't been discussed, which is really important and a tough one. If, for example, you choose to proceed down one or more of these paths and you get more information and you learn more about the ROI on different programs, if you find that a program isn't working that well and you don't think tweaks are going to make it happen, and you instruct them or urge them or tell them to do something else and they don't, or a program continues to effectively fail, broadly defined. We found out that some of the programs that go well in workforce training. It's federal money for the most part, not state money, but what do you do? What does accountability mean if you find people administering a program that they're either kind of fibbing about or isn't successful but continues, because that's what most programs do? You certainly, it's not your job to say, we're not going to give your agency any more money. That doesn't work because you have problems to solve. You can't say, get rid of him because you didn't appoint him. The governor did. So it's a challenge, it seems to me, if I were in your position, how do you respond when clearly the system is not responding to you? And you are the closest thing we have to accountable people. You're elected by small groups of people in little towns. And you're not the governor. The governor has his apparatus to tell his story, but you're talking about telling a different story or learning more about the story. So I'm not sure how you would take matters into your own hands if pressed.
What happens? I'm sorry, Matt. No, you go.
Well, and that is at the end of a implementation or the end of something. We're not even at a cultural acceptance of, is the leadership on board with adding these type or whatever it is that we're going to do. And you're talking about, I thought I heard the committees, the jurisdiction committees have to consider whether they're willing to change some of their operating, and they have an agenda. They have things they need to get done, want to get done and whatnot. So it's a cultural issue and it's a leadership role, and what's the level of commitment within the leadership to adopt a culture along these things before you even get to a spot where, okay, now we've unearthed one, what are we going to do about it? And hopefully that's part of the discussion from much earlier. But it seems to me it's a real bigger question about what's the leadership level of commitment. It's easier to continue to roll along And you did say something earlier, we said, well, you can't, that agency or whatever can't do that. Well, I disagree. They actually obviously could because they did. It doesn't mean that they were supposed to or it was legal, but it's amazing what they can do. They just happens and it rolls along and they're there every day. But I think it's a much bigger question of what's the commitment level and the leadership level. You're talking about a structural change to the review of the agencies that come in at the beginning of the committees, but you're also, and a list of follow-ups to what was passed, not just this last session, but maybe the sessions before. And then you're talking about some kind of commitment to legislation that's going to be proposed out of these committees or come out of the committees. That are they going to go through a series of review of questions? And there's only a limited amount of time and you're on two committees, you got X amount of time and you're going to push through that. Not that I'm advocating to spend more time on those. You have to have a cultural commitment to it before you can go any further.
If I can offer a good example though, of where simple, more consistent application of the types of principles you've been discussing could in practice turn out a better result. So our audit of Dale, the primary issue of dispute, well, it's not really dispute, statute says that assisted living and residential care homes have to be inspected every year. Dale said, we don't have enough people to do that, so we're going to do it every 2 years. So the statute says one thing, they said we either hadn't asked for more resources or hadn't received it from subsequent governors, so they were just going to do it every 2 years.
Which they didn't really do.
After our audit,
like 3 or 4.
Even though they can't do it.
at more or less the same time our audit comes out, there was a request from Dale to add some more people to the program that oversees this. Now, in theory, that should make it more possible that they inspect by every year, but they didn't commit to getting there every year. So one question the committee could have said is, or request could have said, we would like, once they're fully on board, so, assuming that they can hire up, we would like a report in 6 months about whether anything has changed. Are inspections happening more frequently now that you have the more bodies that you said were necessary to do the job? Because we also know that sometimes they get more resources and you sort of do the same amount of work, but everyone has a slightly, maybe on their own level, they're believing a more manageable workload. So that kind of feedback loop where you require them to come back and explain whether they've actually achieved the objective with the resources doesn't require a whole system of review. It just requires the committee to continuously come back to these questions of how can we be sure that these new monies that we're putting out there are achieving the objectives that the agency just told us they're going to give us.
And in that structure, I don't know that there's a specific playbook that requires the chair or the person running the committee to come back to. Plus, you have turnover, every substantial turnover, as most recently anyway, substantial turnover. And
that's where your staff, that's where I think you've been trying to communicate, is that your staff play a very important role, because
you're talking about some kind of standard operating procedures or something for the committees that perhaps doesn't exist, or maybe it does, I don't know. That has a backwards, a current, and a forward sort of view.
Right.
This is a big organization. It's not asking that much. You guys have.
I'm not saying that it can't be done. I will say it can't be done like I was saying. But the leadership and the champion and the piece that has to be on board with wanting to implement some level of accountability or that oversight, whatever you would want to call it, in order to make that structural change. And you've got 2 houses to do it in, and I don't know how that works. I'm definitely going to go back to I'm too new.
Well, and we are here because the speaker was committed to still, it would have been easy to let it slip this year because of what happened. We asked for it to be sunsetted and then we didn't have anything, the government
operations didn't have a chance to get to it. It could have easily slipped off the plate. And I think the good news is that it didn't, because the speaker really cared about it, and the Senate Pro Tem as well. And so
that's step one.
the other thing that happened, which our auditor probably realizes this, but
Last evening, I received an email from Diane through Representative Lanfer of the Appropriations, who's the chair of the Appropriations Committee, who had heard from a member of her committee the importance of the work that we are doing here today. She wanted to give us her support and talk about how important it is in appropriations that they do put in some new rules around every time they hear from the administration, not just letting them give that long spiel and leaving, 4 minutes for questions, and rather send it to us.
Let's have a bunch of questions. Right. So she is what got me, and what I responded with is that this is good. This is what we need, because one of the questions that Tim just asked is, well, what happened, or no, you asked, what happens if they don't do it, right? That you ask them
The right questions, and they say, we didn't get to it and we're not sure when we will. That other piece is that happened to us in our committee, and we brought it to the speaker and said, okay, we've tried on 3 different occasions. What do you think we should do? And then they bring it to the administration directly, to the governor's office. And some things change that way. I think what's hard is that we are all so busy that we don't always notice. And if we don't notice, then just like in any business, that's okay. Then I don't have to add those people, right? The 12, I think we added like 12 people to Dale, and they just didn't, there was no, I don't know, I'm throwing out numbers and we're being recorded, but I know that there was a number that we did add because we knew this was going on, and we're very upset with places not being checked. And we hear from the constituents, and that's that other piece, is what happens when the constituent brings us issues. I asked NCSL about this. Where does that go in the buckets of things that need to be taken a look at, right? I'm sure you get the same thing. Your title is auditor, right? Everybody calls. So how do you know what's real, and how do you bring together a little group of people, and then you tell them?
Are we a group? We do get calls and letters and emails from people who feel that the bureaucracy is not responding to them. We don't have a rapid response team in the auditor's office, and we have no authority to make things happen. We can take your problem, if you call me, to his agency, and it's more likely to get a hearing because I brought it to their attention than otherwise, but that's about it. On occasion, I have to get involved and write something and make it public and basically say to you who contacted me and said, I said, no, not so much. Or if I agree with you, try and share with the people who might be able to get something done on your behalf or for the larger issue. On the other hand, I also have a problem like citizens who sometimes don't get a hearing. I brought an issue to the House Commerce Committee this past year, the year before, about a decision by Betsy to give $5 million to a company that was not allowed to get it by law. And the committee did nothing. Not because they're not good people, but here's one reason why they couldn't. Because the statute says decisions by Betsy for the veggie program are not reviewable administratively or by the judiciary. $5 million. So, this is a matter of legislative construction. It was done, the original program started in the late 90s. It morphed into what it is now. But who knows why they put it there, but they did. And I've mentioned it more than once and nothing happened. So I'm sympathetic to the people who don't get the response they're hoping for. But I thought $5 million would get some people's attention. It didn't.
Maybe now, but will it? Did they change any? I feel like we can always bring up things that are wrong, but the key is, can we fix them?
Well, Emily introduced a bill that went to House Commerce and never made it up.
In terms of how we pick what audits to do, so in general, with the resources we have, and this is probably mysterious to people who don't work in the office, is there is a process by which a team of audit professionals do some initial digging in to basically score the potential audit work, right? Before they're going to set 6 months of their lives out on a task, it's to determine whether it's, a particularly relevant topic, whether the scope of potential
The materiality.
findings are, is it a big money program? Is it a program that affects a lot of people's lives? Those kinds of questions. And there's a whole process of reviewing and scoring before a decision is made to go forward. In some ways, what you're describing in terms of, well, we can't do it for every bill or we can't do it for every topic is a similar process just from the legislative point of view. What are the ones that are the most important? We don't need to worry about a program of $20,000 the same way one with 20 million. And that's something that somebody would just have to decide. Those are the ones that are going to have in the case of New Mexico, every 3-month discussion with the agency for continuity, because you can't do it for everything.
Okay, yeah, that's.
And it's not always money. For example, we did a job on the child protection process for schools and entities that hire folks that interact directly with kids in AHS and elsewhere. It wasn't about money at all, but it didn't take much to persuade me that it was worth our time. And as it turns out, there were some recommendations about parts of the required process that were not happening. Again, not because of bad intent, but because nobody was paying attention. You wouldn't have known that. They don't report what they don't do. That's the rule.
Right, and we don't always know the questions to tease that out, which is what Tina said.
This has been very interesting.
I'm so grateful you guys are taking the time. Thank you. Appreciate it. I don't know what you'll come out with.
I want to thank us until we get to November.
Well, we're happy to help however you guys, whatever direction we're down. And I would just make one recommendation to you. I'm not sure if it's outside my work recommendations here. You can ask for more than 3 meetings. I think you probably should. I know we'll get approved, so.
But you have to ask for that when we go back in January?
No.
That's
There's plenty in the legislative budget for these kinds of things. And I think as long as you have a proper schedule of things that you're going to achieve so that it's realistic that way, because otherwise trying to cram it all in 3 meetings, you're going to have.
Not gonna
An
work.
8-hour meeting.
Because the next meeting, you got to work on the draft.
I know, right, exactly.
Right,
Once
yeah.
to come back and vote on it.
That's what I'm.
But ask for more meetings and do it now so you don't stretch yourself strangely
Okay.
to conform to 3.
Okay, that's good
you.
advice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Keep an eye on us and tell us when we're straying on something that doesn't make a lot of sense, but thanks. Okay, so how are we doing now?
12:15.
That's the time, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
We didn't get to the most important part. What do we want to do in October? What do you all think about today in October, and how do we move forward?
I think we've scratched the surface today. We have homework to do. And I think the homework that we should do is we should take a look at what NCSL has given us today. I assume that their PowerPoint is available to us.
Yes, we have it, and we can put it, we thought,
Yeah, if that could be
also,
shared.
this is Lindsay, for those who don't know. I meant to have her introduce herself to us originally and totally forgot because she's kind of behind me. So thank you for being here as well. And she's going to be helping us on the administrative side. So are you able to put all of that, the information we received from?
The 2 sets of slides?
Yes.
Yes, I can post that to the web.
Okay. And also.
And we've also asked them
Okay.
to provide us with some additional information. For example, we asked for audit committee information regarding the legislature. We should take a look at that in
Yes.
particular in terms of best practices, because that deals with the accountability issue in addition to, or rather deals with the oversight issue in addition to the accountability issue. That should help us at least get some ideas along those lines. From what we've heard, my sense is the New Mexico example is one that's come a bit to the top of the list. And it might be useful to see if we could get someone from New Mexico to speak with us at our next meeting. We should look, I think, also at what else we get from NCSL to see if there's anybody else that we would want to invite that could provide some practical information about how to do some of the things that we want to do. One of the things that certainly came to me today was the notion of, how did I put it? I said it was a deadline report. That's something that just seems to be missing. That's a pretty easy thing to do, is look at all the deadlines and legislations that we've passed, of things that are due, and then advise us to produce that report so that both we and the agencies involved know who's responsible for doing what and when.
Sounds like Tim has that. Sounds like he went through all the things that had reports,
Tim did
rulemaking.
the rulemaking only,
Only, yeah.
but a lot more than that in
Got
terms
it,
of
right.
deadlines that we've imposed in legislation. And there doesn't seem to be any effective mechanism to consolidate all of those due dates, one, and two, to ensure that anybody's done anything about meeting them. And
Right.
that's so fundamental.
It's like we should have a legislative.
People talk about it. Like we were talking about a report and I literally had someone say back to me, oh, it doesn't actually matter if you get it done by the date that is set. Like that's coming from the agency, like it doesn't really matter if we don't get it done. It's like, oh my God.
And it's not just having the report on January 1 when we come back. The report needs to be done ahead of time, and all of the things that are supposed to have been done or be done by that date, the notion of creating a letter, a note, an email, or whatever from, and we'll decide from whom, to the agencies that are supposed to do these things, to remind them that this is something that is due according to legislation and the committees of jurisdiction have been notified, et cetera, to be looking for that at that point in time. It's the alert, because what happens, it's something I've certainly noticed in the past and haven't done anything about, is that these things in fact do happen. And when you come back in the beginning of the year and there are 30,000 reports that are due based on what you asked last year and what was asked the year before, and the year before, and the year, but you don't know if you've seen all those reports. You have no idea whether or not they've come in. And depending upon your chair is not necessarily looking for them. And there's nobody in terms of a committee assistant who's looking for them. Nobody's looking for this stuff.
Right.
And I'm convinced there's a warehouse somewhere in Montpelier that's filled with reports that were supposed to be delivered that never got delivered. But there are also lots of reports that were supposed to be delivered that in fact never got delivered.
Well, and a lot of those reports go unread, so there's that whole other piece, which is, do we ask for too many reports? And it might be better to have people come in and present the information that we want on a date, by a date certain, which is what we're switching to on our committee.
Well, I mean, this again is and this is probably not relevant to what we're talking about here. Well, it is in a way, and that is Govt committee, or the various committees of jurisdiction ought to be looking at the reports that are due them to determine whether or not those reports are in fact of value and whether or not they actually want to see them. Because, you may look, depending on the committee you're on, of the reports that you're scheduled to read, and when are you going to do that? How are you going to do that? Can you do that?
Right.
In our committee, we split them up and then we report on them in committee. Is that what you do too? Yeah. And then we just but it's short and quick and it's always at the beginning. So I get what you're saying for sure. And that should be in our recommendation. You mean not that we want that to look at as our group?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I think the other issue is there anybody in the administration that we want to hear from to help guide us in what we're doing?
I wondered about that too. I'm not sure who the right person would be.
Well,
There
I
is
can
still-
start with just having an offline conversation with the governor's office of what we're doing, and it would be very helpful to get some input from the administration, because some of the solutions that we see are being done in other states have been joint efforts by the legislature and the administration as opposed to legislation. And so that might be the hook that, and they may or may not want to participate since this is a legislative initiative, but I think it's worth asking.
Yes,
I'm
we
happy to
did
make
have,
those calls.
and we did have Susan Zeller, who was chief performance officer, was a member, a voting member of our last member you were there. So it would be great if you could follow up on that.
So I'll follow up.
Yeah, what I have heard a lot, both from the auditor and less directly from NCSL, is that the outcome measures probably need to be updated, more specific, to really be asking the right questions. And I don't, like it sounds like that's not a terribly useful document, and it could be.
You should take a look at it.
I will.
Online, it's the Vermont Outcomes Report, and then there are 10 specific things. They're very broad, as you heard us read them. The part that is though, that they follow. There's no work associated with the big broad ones. Then there's the indicators, and the indicators are all these individual things. And that is what we spent all our time on in the last committee. And it became really, it felt like a useless exercise.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm putting into the conversation is if we're going to have an outcomes measure, it shouldn't be useless.
Yeah. Right.
So I think, yes, there's the question, do we need an outcomes measure? And I think the answer is probably, but that the one we have doesn't sound like it's terribly useful.
Yeah, yeah. Everyone should really look at that. It's on the state website. And it's really a tough thing. And it's something that's filled in by the administration. So how much it impacts the legislature is less clear to me. And that's why we moved away from that. But I think it's important that we all take a look. And honestly, if the administration comes in, or if you find someone, I bet that's what they're going to want to talk about. So it'll work to have everybody having a sort of sense of it. It's not something you can print out. It's pretty long. How about, I just will say for another speaker for next time, I think it would be good to hear from Morgan Crossman, who is the head of Building Bright Futures, and they are the one entity we've put together that's a public-private entity that is all about data measurement of essentially anything that's early ed or childcare. And the reason I'm saying that is she has a PhD in this stuff, and it would be interesting to hear from her what her thoughts are about the exercise we're going through, broad picture, since she's doing it in one tower. You know, she's doing this work, but sees what's going on across government. And works with the administration. So she is that in between. She works with everyone at the Agency of Human Services and the Agency of Education and the legislature. So she balances all of these players, plus Kendall in the governor's office, and works together with everyone to figure out what is the best way to measure the activity going on in these areas and make sure we get back to all those folks. And so I think it would help us to just think through what we might want to do, big picture or not.
What's your last name?
Morgan Crossman.
Crossman.
And she's the head of PBF. Anyway, that's just a suggestion. Others, names, anybody that jumps out at you that you'd really like to hear from at our October meeting?
Can I get back to you on that?
Yeah. Oh,
That'd be great. Okay.
absolutely. Just start.
Yeah,
sort of
definitely thinking. I just can't think of anybody off the top of my head.
Okay. I mean, there's also Jason, is it Jason? That is the Chief Performance Officer now, so takes care of the outcomes report. We could hear from him about how he does it and why he does it and, you know, how he collects the data and that sort of thing.
Well, it would also be useful to at least have a conversation that maybe we have it offline as opposed to in the meeting to determine whether or not we want to invite him to the meeting, is to talk with JFO in terms of what their capabilities are. And in the event that we look for better accountability regarding what we passed, how that affects their resources and how they would go about doing it. And particularly also on the issue of looking at the future, the measurement of future actions taken as to how we might establish in various pieces of legislation how to go about measuring that later, because we're talking about measurement of future performance.
Probably Ledge Council too. That's
Yeah.
an excellent, I like that we would, do we think maybe a little group of us should talk to them offline and then bring
I
it
think
back
it'd be
to
useful,
them?
to have them begin thinking about what it is they could do.
Is there
Help us get there.
anybody who's willing to work in that little group?
What would that group do especially?
Talk with JFO and Ledge Council about what we're doing here and how they could be
look for
helpful.
how they could assist us in doing it, and also about the implications of the kinds of things that we might do to their staffing levels and the composition of their organizations. whether or not that would have any impact. 'Cause
I'm gonna cede to the experienced people in the room for
this
that.
isn't going to be free, quite frankly.
No, right, exactly.
And we probably ought to be thinking about the return of investment, of that investment.
Yeah. And who we talk to, do you want the two of us, I guess? Okay, well.
I'm happy to, but.
Yeah, I agree. I'm with you. Okay, so we'll do that, and if we find that it would be great to have them come in and talk to us, that's great too. Otherwise, we'll just bring you the information.
But, yeah, we obviously just need to drill down further on the likely, whether it be New Mexico or one of the other examples of what seems practical in this space. And I think that where we are right now, first of all, we're looking at legislation that gets passed. It just narrow this down. We're not looking at the world of, outcomes of everything that the state, we're not at that. We're looking at how do we craft legislation that includes measurable results, and that is something that we can look back on to know whether or not it is in fact working.
And also, we're not even creating legislation, we're gonna do essentially, it's a report, but it's like a letter to the speaker, the president pro tem, and the two government
And it
operations
might then
leads.
detail what do we need to do over the next year to get
Yes,
to that point before we theoretically go away at the end of 24.
right. And then should we also be asking about more committee meetings? What do you think?
3 meetings, I mean, we only have 2 left. That's not even enough for us to fully understand the scope of everything that we're doing.
Right,
I know, that seems nuts.
okay.
So how many more meetings do we need, at least before the end of the year? I would say we need 2 in October and 2 in November and 1 in December.
Okay.
Should be 2 in December, but that's what we need.
Oh, and Wendy.
Wendy's back. Hi.
Wendy, I forget that you're out there.
Yeah, I've been here, sorry. I think more meetings makes a lot of sense. And I agree with the other action steps that you've identified too.
Okay, and so do we try and keep our I was thinking that we would have a long October meeting because we'd have to do all this work. But if we are able to get 2 meetings in October, then we could stick to a 3-hour meeting with a planned break in the middle. Does that?
That works better for me, yeah.
Yeah, me too, actually.
Should we calendarize? Should we-
Yeah, I mean, we can do it on Doodle.
Doodle, okay, we're doing.
We'll do a doodle on October dates, and I'll connect with the speaker's office and see.
And
do
I'll
you
deal
check-
with pro.
just to see what do we have to do to get more meetings approved.
I have a question about the TIF regulations.
Yes.
How would we help to change those? Like, who would we approach? I'm not sure the protocol there.
Yeah,
Do we initiate that legislation? Do we test it?
Wonder if he said that he had met with Senator Cummings and Representative Kornheiser, who Representative Kornheiser is on our committee. She's just not here today, so I can ask her, where did that end? Did you all take care of that? Are you going to write legislation?
Because I'd like to follow up, because if the auditor staff spending that much time and they're not seeing a benefit,
It makes total
that might be a
sense.
place that we could make a recommendation.
Yeah, definitely. So let's see, I'll reach out to Representative Kornheiser and ask her to talk to us about that next week.
Right.
Okay. I mean,
Next meeting.
next month.
Might be next week.
No, right, we're already getting into other anything else?
Senator Collmore come in. Is that another person?
I had him on
To do
my
list. I know he's away.
Yeah, just to give us his suggestions after being on the committee for a very long time. He was on government accountability.
I'd like to hear from him personally.
Okay, so I can put him on the list. And do you want me to do it, or did you say you want to do it?
I can reach out to him and ask him.
Okay, you want to do that? That'd be great. Tell him that I'm happy. I mean, he and I are good friends too, so. Anything? So everybody's good with, we're gonna have, everything's on
Committee page.
the committee page, and the way you get to that, does everybody know how to get to it? Okay, and you just, everything will be there, including the report. Do we have the report from the auditor there? We probably should put it.
what we have on the committee page so far is in the left-hand column. It's the committee's enabling Act 53, and then I posted the welcome and introduction from Ledge Council so far.
Okay, so we should probably put the auditor's report on there as well. So if you would like to read it, we'll put, there is a lot of things from NCSL. That there's a whole a group of things on New Mexico. One, I know, did you get that too, or did I just get that? That's the problem. I just got it. I'll make sure to get you all of that. We'll put all of that on there so people can click. There's a lot of places to click and then you get a lot more material. I think did I send it to the community?
There's an email.
Yeah, that had a ton of info.
Oh, good. Okay, so.
How about a link to the outcomes report?
Yeah, and
Also-
a link to the outcomes report on the website would definitely be good.
We can post the report. I'm not sure about linking to it. I will figure that out.
Okay,
Okay.
whatever
And I'll
works.
connect with you about all the things to post.
Okay, good, thank you.
Did we get anything in writing from the auditor's office regarding their presentation today?
We didn't, but I was thinking we should ask Tim. Tim had some real specific things.
Yeah, it would be helpful to
Okay.
have any notes that you might have that can help us. All the
Okay,
things
so-
we didn't write down that he said.
If I need to,
Does anything with the VAA affect any of the work that we're doing?
VAA.
VAA.
Budget adjustment.
Budget adjustment.
Not specifically.
Okay.
It's just, the reason I brought it up is that when the budget adjustment comes out and we look at it, there's, at least in in our policy committees, we look at the areas that are important to us. And what we find often is their money hasn't been spent in programs that we allocated it to.
Okay.
And for some reason, the money's just dropping to the bottom line and being used in totally different agencies. And our questions are always around data. Why wasn't that much money used in the Reach Up program, for example?
Because then, well, I have a friend who's on a probes and they're not, the BAA will not be ready in all likelihood in December.
Oh.
So that puts things back. So maybe we could get Diane in to talk about it maybe?
Oh, well, we don't, it's not
really our thing.
It's more about the culture of the committees that we were talking
Right.
about earlier. That is like, how do you?
It just would be nice to have access to that data before we start up again, that we could weave into our committee and say, okay, like, these folks haven't met. It's just another cross-check of who isn't spending the money that they said they would.
I see what you're saying.
You know, in an easier way than each of us trying to figure out, okay, I'm gonna go to Agency of Ag.
I don't think we're gonna get that detailed. If we
Okay.
get too detailed, we're stepping on the toes of the policy committees. So
Okay.
the policy committees are supposed to do that. My only point in bringing them up was we need to help the policy committees know what kind of questions they can ask.
Right. I'm just trying to think of like to Randy's point of the reports that are due. If somehow there's a way to sort of say, okay, well, if they were supposed to spend 20 million, they've only spent 10, are we missing a report?
I see.
I'm just trying to think of a way that's easier to figure out who owes a report and who doesn't, and that feels really big to me.
Probably the issue, I think, is you almost have to look at legislation, because if there's a report that is required, it's not been done, you're not going to find it any other way.
Right, good point, okay.
It'll just be.
Well, somebody goes through that, you know, they obviously do, we rewrite it, or you look at, so making a checklist or making a list by jurisdiction.
Well, the
by
Ledge
policy,
Council
shouldn't be that
may
hard.
have that information, between Ledge Council and JFO, may have that information already.
Then we want that to come back to the policy.
It may have been done already as part of the annual closeout process of what the legislature has done. So it may.
Surely someone has a mess.
May exist already. But the thing that bothers me about solely looking at what's been done last year is you've got reports that were done in 1994, legislation passed in 94 that requires an annual report.
Oh,
That hasn't been repealed for all we know. Some of them are coming in and some of them are not.
right.
And getting at those, I mean, I don't want to go back through, but going back through the last 3 or 4 years of legislation might be a feasible thing to do at some point.
Right. Makes sense.
Well, and this is sort of tangentially related, but, and it's been processing, and maybe it's two entities within the administration, but there's the piece of like the outcomes report and all of the reports, but there's also the piece that I ran into in committee of, and it sounds like you did too, of agencies telling us, well, we can't give you that information. And that is a problem to me, to accountability. Like, if you can't give it to us, why? And what do you need to be able to give it to us? And I think that we need to, within this space, be able to have that conversation too. I don't know, maybe it's digital services that needs to come in and talk about what would be needed to upgrade in those spaces, so that when we're asking for information for accountability, the answer isn't we can't, and then it's done. And I don't know who that is, but I do want to, I think as we're talking about accountability, have the conversation around what type of upgrades might be needed to actually get the information that we need.
Wendy had her hand up.
Wendy.
Yeah, and actually, I think Tanya's suggestion is good, and it would be helpful to have someone from digital services, because those conversations came up in our committee with regard to the labor department. The we can't get you that kind of answer. But to the previous conversation that you were having on analyzing what was supposed to be done, I don't know. I think we should ask for Tim Ash's report if he's willing to share it. He said he looked at 2017 to 2021 and at legislation in that period of time that required action. And what did he say? But that was some really good information that he had. So I think if he would share that report with us, I think that would be really helpful and could be a starting point.
Yeah, it was excellent. I mean, I definitely think we should ask him for that. It was around rulemaking though. That was the only piece that he looked back at. So, and he said there were about 70 different.
He said there were, 125 new rules.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then 70 that were applicable, right? And then 30 hadn't been met. So it'd be great to look at that. I think we have to be careful that we don't get too into the details. We're going to make recommendations up here about what should happen overall in order for there to be better government accountability, legislative oversight.
But this would be a great place to actually have the data, and not that we have to drill down and say, but, we have 70 legislative actions that had rules attached to them that have not been met. There are, since 2015.
Right, to use examples in our report.
Right, to use data and say, we are missing 85% of the reports that are owed to us based on legislation done in the last 5 years.
Great, that's exactly what
I'm not saying that we need to get like each little person.
But the recommendation ends up being, we should have a mechanism for this.
Right, but I think we also need to prove that it's failing.
Yeah.
Because if we're not getting reports, how can we possibly legislate well?
Yes, exactly. And so our job is to show that at a higher level. So we show the data on a specific example, but then give a recommendation that's broader than that.
Do your damn reports.
Yeah.
Stop making laws and ask for reports.
Sometimes you need a report though. Sometimes.
Yeah, and it's hard. You know how busy things get in committee, and all of a sudden you lose out. But it definitely makes me think before I go back. I want to look at all the bills in the human services. Yeah. What was that? Sorry.
Wouldn't it be amazing to see a list by policy committee of what is expected that you've passed?
So my committee assistant in judiciary does that. I get a list of all the reports that we've asked for. I get a list of all of the rulemaking but it's so committee specific.
Exactly.
Because I'm learning not every committee does that.
I think we're all sort of learning that everybody has their different ways that they go.
Right.
And that's okay, but maybe a nice what we're going to make a recommendation on is a manual for committees like here, or just a way to make sure that government is being accountable might be, and then give some suggestions.
Sweet.
So what we want to hear from people on is those suggestions and keep people being broad instead of specific. So if we hear from the Agency of Digital Services, it would be more around how much can they do without legislation and money behind it, I guess, right?
Or are there specific upgrades that are needed to be able to collect certain type, I.
What are the stumbling blocks?
Yeah, what's getting in the way? Yeah.
And it might be just they're not getting reports.
Right. Like I know in judiciary, when we were running into the, it was corrections, we just can't give you that information, we just can't give you that information. We did legislate, okay, come back and tell us why you can't give us that information then. No, I don't, actually. That's okay. Corrections.
Good. Well, I apologize because we are almost an hour now.
I know.
But
So next steps,
next steps.
beautiful, read everything about New Mexico.
And all of those, you might think Colorado's better.
I would love to see also from those guys, a state that's an equivalent population to ours for what they've done.
Asked for that.
Rhode Island,
But yeah, okay,
Because New Mexico's got 2.2 million,
yeah.
still on the small side for a state, but we're tiny compared to everybody else. But I liked what they did. I thought it was good.
Good, okay. Okay, so I'll check on that too. And then we're going to get together with JFO and Ledge Council, so another job to bring in. What else did we promise that we would? The outcomes report
The
will be posted.
administration regarding
You're gonna do that,
their desire to participate with us.
okay?
We're all gonna read the outcomes report.
Yep, look at the outcomes report and look at NCSL's reports.
Perfect.
Whatever else CSL provides us based on the requests that we made today.
And then one or both of you will send out a doodle poll for the next, can you just do it for all the next meetings?
Yes, you want to do, sure,
For October, November, and December, that'd be awesome.
okay.
And do you have anything else that we haven't gotten yet?
It's just these guys, I think.
Oh.
Those other ones with.
I don't know what that
Eyes
is.
on them.
Yeah, this is, and you don't have to take it, you can look, we're gonna put this on the website, on that website, but this is Doug Hopper's evaluation of the Government Accountability Committee, which was really not very good. So you can take a look at that. And if you look on on the website, there are recommendations.
Like the white copies.
Oh, and they didn't like that. They wanted them in color.
Copy, I can write on the copy, I can look at the screen, whatever.
If you're like me, there's video online.
There's a video? Oh, word.
And you don't have to do all that thing. He does a video.
Okay.
Wow.
About it.
All right, good.
Sweet. Is the cafeteria open?
Yes, well, it was this morning.
Okay.
It still is.
Yeah,
Okay.
usually on the off session, it's open, just closes earlier, right?
Yeah.
I'm starving. Okay, I gotta go. I have to go to work.
Okay.
But you got their attention.
Thank you.
I got another thing.
Thank you. And Wendy, I hope we see you in person next time, but you're far away. If we don't, I get it. Good to see your face.
That's my plan. See you soon.
Hey, well.
Bye.
See you soon.
Bye.
I'm gonna ask Emily Kwanzaa about something too.
By the way,
Oh,
this
that's
is
nice.
more
Constituents.
It-
Just wants to do another report about what we did.
Oh, I,